This is the deadliest plane crash in history. At first, it seems like a normal day at Delhi airport, but this soon changes when an airline pilot makes one terrible mistake. Yes, you heard that right. We are talking about a time where air travel was becoming increasingly popular and affordable for the general public. But with the excitement of exploring new destinations came a risk that few had anticipated. The aviation industry was still relatively new, and there was much to be learned about safety protocols and aircraft maintenance. This causes a massive explosion that kills more than 200 people. How did this happen? And how could this pilot have prevented this disaster? This plane was on its way from Mumbai to Calcutta and was carrying a full load of passengers and cargo. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. They knew that, in a matter of seconds, their lives would be turned upside down. As the dust settled, the true extent of the damage became clear. Many had suffered serious injuries and were unable to move. She had been sitting in the back of the DC-3 when the collision occurred, and had somehow managed to free herself from the wreckage. She returned to the scene of the accident, where she found many of the DC-3 passengers still trapped in the wreckage. They formed a human chain to pass passengers from the wreckage to the waiting ambulances, working quickly to save as many lives as possible. Among them was Captain Joe Mokenga, the veteran pilot who had been overseeing the maintenance of the aircraft. His death was a tragic loss, not just for his family and friends, but for the entire aviation industry. The investigators also discovered human error had played a significant role in the crash. New protocols were established to ensure that all aircraft were thoroughly inspected before takeoff, and pilots were required to undergo additional training to improve their skills and judgment. Many of them had lost multiple members in the crash and were left to pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives. Support groups were set up to help them cope with their grief, and the Indian government provided financial compensation to the families of those who had died. The pilots of both planes had failed to follow proper procedures, which had contributed to the disaster. The crash had not only claimed the lives of many, but it also raised serious questions about the safety of air travel in India. The country's aviation industry was shaken to its core, and steps were taken to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. Working tirelessly, she helped to free them and transport them to the nearest hospital. Memorial services were held across the country to pay tribute to the victims and their families. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and she was in a state of shock. But as she looked around at the devastation that surrounded her, she knew that she had to do something to help the others. The suddenness and violence of the impact had left them dazed and confused, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Their names are inscribed on memorials, and their stories are told to ensure that their sacrifice is never forgotten. The tragedy serves as a reminder of the importance of aviation safety and the need for constant vigilance and improvement in the face of new challenges. The chaos of the moment, the screeching of metal, the shattering of glass, and the screams of terrified passengers still ringing in their ears. A memorial was erected to honor the victims, and visitors would leave flowers and pay their respects. The tragedy had left an indelible mark on the community, and the memory of those who had died was kept alive. They emerged from the wreckage, shaken but alive. The wreckage was strewn across a wide area, and the impact had been so severe that it was difficult to immediately determine the number of casualties. Their investigation revealed a series of mechanical failures that had ultimately led to the disaster. The DC-3's malfunctioning engine had not been properly addressed before takeoff, and the Boeing 747 had veered off course due to its own mechanical problems. But one thing was certain: this was not going to be a simple recovery operation. The moment of impact was devastating. The two planes collided midair, and the ensuing explosion was catastrophic. Debris rained down from the sky, and the sound of the crash echoed across the countryside. It was a scene of unimaginable horror and destruction. The DC-3's malfunctioning engine posed a serious threat to the safety of everyone on board, and the pilots were struggling to keep it airborne. Meanwhile, the Boeing 747 was veering dangerously off course due to mechanical problems of its own. The pilots desperately tried to correct the plane's trajectory, but it was too late. The two planes were on a collision course, and disaster was imminent. The Boeing 747 was one of the most advanced planes of its time, and was considered to be one of the safest modes of transportation available. The passengers on board felt confident and secure as they settled into their seats and prepared for takeoff. Little did they know they were about to become part of a terrifying ordeal. It was May 1949 when thousands of passengers were traveling by air for the first time ever, and for engineers who were there to oversee the maintenance of the aircraft. One of the engines had malfunctioned due to poor maintenance, and it had to receive proper attention before takeoff. This meant that as the plane reached cruising altitude, the engine began to falter, putting the lives of everyone on board at risk. Among them was a former World War II pilot named Joe Mokenga. He was highly experienced and respected among his peers, but he had made a terrible mistake that would cost him dearly. On this particular day, two planes collided mid-air over the skies of India, causing unimaginable devastation. The first plane involved in this tragic incident was a British DC-3 transport aircraft. It was owned by Tata Airlines, a major player in India's aviation industry. This particular DC-3 had a long and storied history, having been used during World War II for military operations. Now it was being used to transport passengers between cities across the country. The plane was filled to the brim with excited travelers ready to embark on their journeys. They had no idea that their lives were about to change in the most horrific way possible. But they weren't the only ones on board. The plane also carried a crew of 8, including a pilot, a cook, 3 cabin crew members. As the plane soared through the clouds, everything seemed to be going well. However, underneath the surface, disaster was brewing. As if this wasn't enough, another plane was approaching the area. It was a massive Boeing 747 jet airliner owned by a reputable airline company. The pilots of both planes were trying their best to keep their aircraft steady and under control. As the planes hurtled towards each other, the passengers on board were filled with terror. In the aftermath of the crash, a thick plume of smoke billowed into the air, marking the spot where the two planes had collided. The survivors of the crash were traumatized and in shock. Among the survivors was a young woman named Geeta. With the help of a good Samaritan, Geeta made her way to a nearby village, where she alerted the locals to the crash and organized a rescue party. Amidst the tragedy, acts of heroism emerged. Several passengers from the Boeing 700, which had suffered less damage than the DC-3, rushed to help the survivors. But not everyone was so fortunate. The force of the collision had been so strong that many of the DC-3 passengers had been killed instantly. In the days that followed the crash, a team of investigators was assembled to determine the cause of the accident. But these technical issues were only part of the story. In the wake of the tragedy, measures were taken to improve aviation safety in India. The families of the victims were left devastated, struggling to come to terms with the loss of their loved ones. As news of the disaster spread, people across the country were shocked and saddened. Authorities worked tirelessly to identify the remains of the victims and provide them with a dignified burial or cremation. In the years that followed, the site of the crash became a place of remembrance. Today, the world remembers the victims of the deadliest plane crash in India's history. And that's all for the day. See you next time.